introduce Fernanda Brenner, who's an independent curator. In 2012, she founded Pivô, a non-profit contemporary art space in Sao Paulo, where she serves as artistic director. The context it follows directly on from what Barbara just presented. We refer to something like Laboratorium as a research exhibition. And so then the question, of course, of any form of learning, we assume many forms of learning produce research, but then what happens when that research needs to leave the space of production, so whether it's the artist studio or the laboratory or the university or the school even, and then begin to interface with something like the public. And so it gives me great pleasure to now ask Fernanda to make some remarks regarding that. Thank you very much.
Hello. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation from Global Forum. It's an honor to be here, especially talking to Barbara, because a Laboratorium is a huge reference from Pivô, so I'm honored to be here next to you talking today. Well, I think the most important thing to talk about Pivô is that it is, so to say, a site-specific and context-oriented institution. So it's a very peculiar story how it came to be. So this image that you see here is with the vende in Portuguese means for sale, is that this is São Paulo's most iconic building. It's called the Copa Building. It's a project by Oscar Niemeyer, pretty much based on the Le Corbusier d'Unité d'Habitation or the Rockefeller Center, where Niemeyer was trying to somehow build a city within a city. So it's a mixed-use building where nowadays 5,000 people live. So this space, Pivô, is in, that's here? Yeah. Is 3,500 square meters, and it was abandoned for 25 years. So for me, this was a very important starting point to think about exhibitions and to think about an institution in itself, which is what kind of a city allows a space like that to be abandoned in its most iconic building, or worse, allows somebody to live a space like that abandoned in such an iconic building. So to make somehow a very irresponsible comparison, the relevance of Copa to São Paulo is the Empire State to New York, so you can imagine what does it mean. So it's a very long story how we got the space, but the space is like, here you can see the building. It's like this S-shaped monster in the very downtown area of São Paulo. So São Paulo is a very, very densely populated city. So it's 22 million people city. So we had to start working, to start the institution, we had a ruin, a museum-sized ruin, absolutely no funding in this landmark building in the middle of a city as complex as São Paulo. So, yeah, so this is how the space was. When we started working there in 2011 and 12, it began with an author's occupation, so we have no plan. I got the keys for the space. Nowadays we have a lease. This is important to say, a 15-year lease for the space. And what we did was pretty much invite a lot of artists from the local scene in and ask questions. So we did an exhibition, pretty much a hands-on exhibition, trying to inquire and trying to talk a lot with each other, how this, what this gigantic space should be. How can we build an institution from scratch? How can we work and to transform this into the space we wanted it to be. So my job as a curator and as the founder of the institution was to make notes and to listen to artists. So I think this is something very important, that we never really planned the institution in its with all these departments. Oh, this is the communication, this is finance. It was like pretty much a hands-on experience that we learned by listening and I think facing the adversities, which was this situation. So this image that you see here in the left is the very first work that we put in. Is an exhibition that was called very symptomatically, "Next Time I Would Have Done It All Differently." And is a work by Carmela Gross, which is a very established Brazilian artist. So for us, we were kids. It was an honor for having her working with us, and the confidence that she pretty much gave us the project and said, do it. So this big lamp here, it means Aurora, that means dawn. So the very first gesture of opening Pivô was asking Carmela to turn on this piece and to put some light into this ruin that was closed for 25 years. So this is a bit, yeah. So this is some of the activities that we do. I think an important aspect of the program of Pivô is that we work mainly with solo shows. So this first movement that was really getting in touch with artists and talking a lot led to the way the program is shaped. So what is interesting in Pivô is that all the exhibitions take a long time to happen. So it's conversations that start with an invitation, and then we follow an artist process, and we try to adapt the institution every time to each project. So, and also, of course, nowadays, I'm sorry, I got a bit lost. So solo shows and residencies. We have a big residency program that is studio-based. So I think it relates a lot to some aspects of what Barbara just mentioned. We really think about nowadays, after 20 years after laboratory, I think a lot of artists are coming back to studios. And Pivô's residencies is pretty much finding a way to leave artists alone in the best sense. So it's a research-oriented residency, it lasts 3 months. So they don't need to get to any conclusions, they don't need to deliver any kind of practical outcome. So it's pretty much tailored to the interests of every artist that apply. So we have a small curatorial team that, again, asks a lot of questions, and we try to shape every residency along with the artists, and to create a group, a dynamic group that is that during 3 months work a lot together. So it's not exactly a school, but I would say it's a nice starting point of thinking about what the school should be and could be. So we have a plan that maybe, in the next year we are going to direct this residency program to become more educational oriented, because I would say São Paulo has a very unhealthy art scene, in the sense that we have a strong market, very big established galleries, and few institutions, but very institutions that are a bit bureaucratic in their structures and don't have the mobility. And that's pretty much nothing in between. So no Kunsthalle models, no artist-run spaces, and the cultural policies for spaces like that are very, very difficult. So Pivô is one of the few spaces that try to operate in between the commercial and the more formal institutions, so to say. So somehow to provide artists with a context for experimentation and for try and error, and for I think this is the luxury of having a space this size, is that we are free to change our minds all the time. We're free to react to whatever comes into context, which in Brazil is a lot and fast. It's fine. So I think we're running out of time, so I'm going to show some images quickly of the shows we did, and then we can discuss further. This is an opening, so it's usually 700 people.
There's the other kind of opposite end of that, which is the creation of these spaces for creation and research. And Barbara, for instance, when you talked about the alchemical tradition and the intimacy of the studio, it seemed very apart from that public face. So I'm curious, curatorially, what the navigation is there of this distinction between sort of public outreach and these sort of maybe even breaking down the walls of these private places of production.
Hello? Yeah. So for laboratorium, I mean, it's always a bit different, but for laboratorium, this was a very exceptional, a very unique situation, because basically Bruno Verbergt, who was responsible for this 400-year celebration of Anton van Dyck, said to us, well, if you're really going to do a laboratorium, we're maybe not going to do an exhibition, because like in any laboratory, if the outcome is something that you decide that this cannot be an exhibition, then there should be no exhibition. He just asked us that if we would not do an exhibition, we would at least do a scientific report about the failure. So that was an incredibly luxury situation. So what we did was start with what usually happens in science and in other fields of research, is to set up a brainstorming group, a core group of people, which would lead us to go into this question and evolve. I said we will at once give away, which I did in the beginning, spaces throughout the cities for artists to occupy this city in a similar way as scientists and other people are already doing. But on the other hand, the idea of what exhibition had to come and how this public had to be related to it was very open, but also complicated, because as I said in the beginning, we never wanted to make the failure of just doing an exhibition that was just going to be a representation of some kind of subject that you could better read in a book. And so the exhibition opened, and at the end of the exhibition, I think we managed to get the lowest level of public possible. Maybe we had 800 visitors or something like that. But we expressed it in time and said we were sure that many of the people who came to our exhibition came for weeks to this exhibition. They basically like real scientists and people. So we transformed that too. And we managed to convince, it has remained, of course, a huge debate in my country. Like, how could they do this, use so much money for this experiment? So the relation with the public was radical, complicated, and it was an exhibition that was received very critically by the public. Nobody saw any reason why to look at all these processes, but that's part of how it went. That's the honest answer.
Thank you for the directives. And I imagine you also have some, I don't know, stories in terms of public engagement?
Yes, a lot. Well, I think it starts with the fact that I was telling that we are in this crazy situation of being in the basement of a building where 5,000 people live, which is like a small European village. And so we start with a potential audience of 5,000 people. That doesn't mean that they come. So I think when we started to do the project, we somehow took this for granted. Oh, we're going to open this great space, bring artists in, and everybody will engage and welcome us, and that's not entirely true. So we found out that something that is also very important to me is to really stress this idea of exhibitions as a media, so what we can do as an exhibition. So something I didn't tell in the presentation about Pivô is that Pivô means pivot, which is the central pin, as something that turns. So when we're slowly renovating the space for the past 8 years, so I think since the beginning was this combination of artists and workers in a we never closed the space, and we always did exhibitions while restoring and renovating the space. So I think all the neighbors and the people, because it's like you've seen images of how the center of the city is, the building is in a pedestrian area. So we're always renovating, and we always left the door open. So a lot of people came, and without realizing what it was, oh, is this a museum? Is this a store? Is this a gallery? And I think we learned a lot by this one-to-one relationship with the passerby audience, which was not exactly an art audience, because the art audience, of course, was the easiest one to drag. So we had, I think, in the first openings of Pivô, I would say I knew 80% of the audience, and nowadays, 8 years later, I know 25, which I'm very happy with that. But I think since São Paulo is a city that is so hard to navigate, it's a 22 million people city, Pivô somehow became this meeting point for the artistic community. So there's a lot of artists that are there in the residency, there's a lot of artists that go there to hang out with the artists in the residencies, and there's a lot of people that go there to sit in the balcony and do a meeting. So I think we're slowly build an audience that goes there regardless of the exhibitions, and they bump into an exhibition on their way to a shop in the commercial gallery. So I really like this idea of having a less mediated relationship to the public. So I wondered maybe Laboratorium has something in that aspect that people just walk in and didn't quite understand what it was, and then felt, I don't know, the exhibition somehow as a starting point to reflection and to, I don't know, to somebody that goes out with it from the exhibition with a lot of questions and intrigued to come back and see what's next. So I think this is
an accidental experience, or
possibly, yeah.
engagement.
Well, I think it wasn't accidental. It just shifted very clearly. It made a line very clear between an audience that comes to see things and an audience that wanted to be engaged. We had a strong, engaged audience, but we had no public in a kind of like viewing situation sense, I think. But I'll add to that the reason why this was possible in Antwerp was because the people who organized it were very, very aware that it needed that kind of radicalism publicly in order to shift the paradigm. This is why I'm saying we were responsible at a certain moment to really make this device function as, even in its dysfunctionality, to create a message of concerns, of awareness, of preoccupations. And that echoed in Antwerp something that happened exactly 30 years before that, 50 years from now. The first alternative art space was created in Antwerp by Casper Koenig and, Lamont de Jong and many other people. And it was kind of this awareness from the funders. They realized that in the time in the 60s, it was auto-generated and auto-funded by the artists to have this radicality. And they realized that at this later moment that their funding was either going to be superficial or be riskful and be engaged with the project. So it's a lot of elements that make that our question of where to position the audience. I think we asked the same kind of radicality of the audience to miss everything, even possibly, like in the experiment.
Which gets all of us perhaps halfway to the question I wanted to sort of wrap up with, which is how you I think both projects deal with so many different stakeholders. So we discussed the community. We've also touched on the specific considerations of the individual cities in terms of the density of the population, in terms of the history. And then, of course, there's this implied sort of institutional expectations, in addition to the public expectations of the art public and the non-art public. You're being accountable for a lot of people. How do you do that?
This was, in my case, I don't know, in your case, it was built on relationships of trust. I had worked in Antwerp for more than 4 or 5 years. I had been responsible for the culture capital of Antwerp, which is like a big festival thing, and I had a hangover from it, and I told the intendant, I don't think this is the right place for art. So he said, tell us, what is it? And they were, it was based on these relationships. So it actually, Antwerp Laboratorium got at the time $1 million purely from politicians, which is very exceptional. We didn't have any sponsor we needed. And it was based on these years of trust with these people, I think.
Yeah, I think in Pivô's case, it also has a lot to do with trust, and I think any important change within the art field, it's like the result of the dynamics between a lot of people. So I think in Pivô's case, the first, it's like getting the key for the private owner of the space and allowing us to turn that ruin into a functioning art space was something very brave of him. And but me, I had no previous experience in running an institution. I was working with production design in films, and when he said to me, "Oh, why don't you turn this thing into something permanent?" and I answered with an artist mind, not with an executive mind. Yeah, sure, why not? Without realizing my entire life will become about this, putting this ruin back into life for the past 8 years, 24/7. But I think the first group of artists that started to work there with the most absurd conditions, like we had no toilets, I forgot to say, is a ruin, but before that was a hospital. So we were working in hospital that was closed for 20 years. So you can imagine the conditions that the space was in. So everybody was there. Yeah. So everybody was there working full time to build an art space and with a lot of questions. We had no idea how we're going to fund that space in a city that has no cultural policies. So then we build an inner economy to the space, and that rely on a lot of different sources, none of them stable. So Pivô still is not completely sustainable in terms that we cannot plan in long term. We have no idea if the space is, although it looks pretty established from the images, it's not. So we have no idea if the doors are going to be open next year, if we're going to be able to commission projects or I think for me this is the ethics of the space is something very important. Like we never do a show if you don't have the basic conditions to do a show, which is paying artist fees, enabling the setting that it's necessary to welcome an audience and to create a meaningful discussion. So it's like this is this completely process-oriented institution that we build as we go, and it's always working with this Heston to find a way to keep the pace with the program that we started to do 8 years ago. And for that, the residency is very important. Having artists there, we have 20 artists on a daily basis in the space. So this is something that is crucial for the space.
I mean, for both projects, it would seem that there's a presence required. But I'm so grateful that you both brought up the notion of trust, which I hope we'll return to in later sessions, which we've got to move on to now, unfortunately. But I think that that's so bound up with also our experience of education, of being students and of being taught as well, this notion of trust. So thank you so much. Thanks.